Welcome back once again. This is the fourth episode of this series. The topic we'll be looking at now is suicide attacks. As I was growing up, suicide bomb attacks against Israelis was, in my experience, supported overwhelmingly by Muslims. I grew up in a family that could be considered moderate at every level, but they still supported these attacks against Israelis, and it was taboo to suggest that they were wrong. It was a topic that was closed to debate thanks to ultranationalist and religious fervour. It probably still is fairly widely supported, but I think the level of support for such acts is generally decreasing among Muslims. I could be wrong about that trend, but Pew Research suggests that there is a general downward trend in support of suicide attacks by the general populations. Other polls, however, certainly don't give us much room for hope, especially as it appears younger Muslims are more likely to be in favour of suicide bombings than older ones. It's strange to me that there would be any support for such barbarity, especially when we take into consideration that nowadays the vast majority of suicide bomb attacks occur in Muslim countries where Muslims, especially minority sects like the Shias, are the number one victims of such atrocities. Suicide attacks was one of the points that I had previously, even after leaving Islam, thought never really had a justifiable reason from within Islamic sources. After all, I'd known that committing suicide was forbidden in Islam. Obviously, there couldn't really be a precedent set for suicide bomb attacks, as explosives weren't invented until way after Muhammad's death. So how do the Sunni Salafist groups who attack minority Muslims and non-Muslims on a near-daily basis justify their attacks, given that suicide on its own is forbidden across all of Islam's sects? We see a hadith here by Mohammed who says there are no better people than two examples he gives. One of these examples is of a warrior who fearlessly goes into places expecting death. The Messenger of Allah said, "Of the men he lives the best life who holds the reins of his horse, ever ready to march in the way of Allah, flies on its back whenever he hears a fearful shriek or a call for help, flies to it seeking death at places where it can be expected." So basically here, he encourages people to seek death at places where it can be found. We have another example of where Muhammad encouraged fighters to fight to the death. While facing the enemy, the Messenger of Allah said, "Surely the gates of paradise are under the shadows of the swords." A man in a shabby condition got up and said, "Abu Musa, did you hear the Messenger of Allah say this?" He said, "Yes." He returned to his friends and said, "I greet you," a farewell greeting. Then he broke the sheath of his sword, threw it away, advanced with his naked sword towards the enemy, and fought them with it until he was slain. So, what we have here is a man who is encouraged by a promise of heaven, breaks his sheath knowing that he'll go straight into the enemy and kill until he is finally killed. We now go to the commentary of the Quran by Al-Qurtubi, one of the most respected exegetes in mainstream Islam. Only one volume has been translated into English for his work, but luckily for us, volume 1, page 500 says the following. "If he knows and thinks it is probable that he will kill the one he attacks and survive, that is good. If he knows and think it probable that he will be killed, but will cause great harm or open a path which the Muslims can use, then it is also permitted." Muhammad ibn al-Hasan said, "If one man attacks 1,000 idolaters on his own, there is no harm in that if he hopes to survive or inflict great damage on the enemy. If that is not the case, then it is disliked because he exposes himself to destruction without any benefit for the Muslims. If his intention is to encourage other Muslims to follow him, it may be permitted because of the benefit for the Muslims involved. If he intends to terrify the enemy and show them the resolve of the Muslims, it may also be permitted." The position here is clear. Even if you're going into certain death, it can be justified if you can inflict terror on your opponents and kill many in return for your death. The scholar I just quoted has taken this context from a concept in Islam called tatarrus, which literally means shield, as in a person goes into the middle of the enemy and becomes completely surrounded by them. Another source for this comes in a book explaining the Sharia laws derived from the Quran, written by a highly respected Sunni Hanafi scholar who lived around 1,000 years ago. The Hanafi sect is largely considered fairly moderate. It has its own violent extremists too, especially the Deobandi subsect, but it's arguably the most moderate sect within the four schools of Sunni Islam. While the Hanbali school of thought is often seen as more extreme, with a stubbornness that often sees it stick to what the first 3 generations of Muslims did, emphasizing their actions as the ideal to follow, and often dismissing the opinions of scholars who came later and tried to reinterpret some teachings. So let's see what this Hanafi scholar, Ahmad ibn Ali al-Razi, says in volume 1 of his book, The Rulings of the Quran. He He is talking about whether a Muslim fighter can throw himself into the middle of the enemy on a suicidal mission. If there was no benefit to his action, then he should not sacrifice himself where there is no gain for the religion or the Muslims. But if his sacrifice has a benefit for the religion, then this is considered honourable. Suicide bombings in this day and age, however, is by no means a subject for which there is consensus.
الأصل في هذه الأمور إنها لا تجوز إلا بتدبير جماعي. عن الأصل الإنسان يقاتل فيقتل، إنما عشان يفجر نفسه هذا لابد أن الجماعة هي التي ترى إنها في حاجة إلى هذا الأمر. إذا الجماعة رأت أنها في حاجة إلى من يفجر نفسه في الآخرين ويعني يكون هذا أمرا مطلوبا، وتدبر الجماعة كيف يفعل هذا بأقل الخسائر الممكنة.
ده دين يا اخواننا، احنا بنتكلم الان بقرآن. يعني اللي انا بقوله دي الكلام اللي انا بقوله ده حقائق مطلقة لا تقبل الشك ولا التغيير الى يوم القيامة، مستحيل، لان ده قرآن. ولن ترضى عنك اليهود ولا النصارى حتى تتبع ملتهم. قرآن. اسأل الله ان يتقبله عنده في الشهداء. الله. بعدين بقى يطلع بقى الكلاب في كل أبواق الإعلام، الإرهاب، الكباب، التطرف.
نرى أن العمليات الانتحارية التي يتيقن الإنسان أنه يموت فيها حرام، بل هي من كبائر الذنوب، لأن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم أخبر بأن من قتل نفسه بشيء فإنه يعذب به في نار جهنم، ولم يستثن شيئا، بل هو عام. ولأن الجهاد في سبيل الله المقصود بحماية الإسلام والمسلمين، وهذا المنتحر يدمر نفسه ويفقد بانتحاره عضو من أعضاء المسلمين، ثم إنه يتضمن ضررا على الآخرين، لأن العدو لن يقتصر على قتل واحد، بل يقتل به أمما إذا أمكن، ولأنه يحصل من التضييق على المسلمين بسبب هذا الانتحار الجزئي الذي قد يقتل 10 أو 20 أو 30، يحصل ضرر عظيم، كما هو الواقع الآن بالنسبة للفلسطينيين مع اليهود.
To my surprise, one of Saudi Arabia's most famous clerics, known for many extreme positions, actually came out and banned suicide attacks against Jews or anyone else. And here I'm referring to Sheikh Ibn Baz, who was the former Saudi Grand Mufti who died a number of years ago. But there are other clerics like the Salafist cleric Al-Albani who permitted the attacks in certain scenarios, mostly what I've already mentioned. So, in conclusion to this point on suicide bomb attacks, there are varying opinions among Muslims whether blowing oneself up is allowed, or whether it's considered suicide. I can see how militants can easily look at the opinions of earlier scholars and take that all as a green light. But we also have numerous well-respected modern-day scholars, respected even amidst your typical Salafist jihadi, who say it's forbidden. So I guess the issue is not entirely conclusive one way or another, but it does appear to be leaning more favourably on the side of those who say it's lawful within Islam, given the historical examples and interpretation of reputable Muslim scholars. So in conclusion, the whole idea of suicide bombings and suicide attacks can be justified with a reading of Islamic texts, but it would require some more mental gymnastics to make it work. But it's not as clear-cut and obvious as the previous topics that we've already mentioned. In the next episode, we'll be looking at slavery within Islam. So join me then, where there'll be plenty to say about this topic. And thank you for watching, and goodbye.